Well, hi everyone, and welcome. We're so excited to have you all here to join us for Neuro and CompSci with Dr. Konrad Kording. We are incredibly honored to be joined by Konrad, a renowned computational neuroscientist and Penn Integrates Knowledge University professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments in the Perelman School of Medicine and the School of Engineering and Applied Science. He is also the co-founder of Neuromatch and Community for Rigor. So I guess to start, Conrad, if you want to go ahead and kind of maybe tell us what inspired you to pursue a career in computational neuroscientist, like where did you start and what were some key turning points in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, like, let's start with at the beginning. Now, like, who of you knows what you'll do later in your career? Okay, that is probably the correct and honest answer. I had no idea. I went to school. I was good at math. I like did some like youth competition things. I like participated in like the student national science competition in Germany and did well on it. And like I did like math at school and I did programming and programming competitions and things like that. But I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I wanted to study something computational. So I studied physics, which like super resonated with my way of thinking. And as soon as I started physics, like second term or something, 1 year in, I was like, like this physics thing, it's kind of like a little like old school. And I started talking with people about biology, and I found like they had like occasionally they have this thing where you can like buy like books like super cheaply, and I get like a biochemistry book and like a molecular biology book. And I was like, wow, that stuff is awesome. I love that. And kind of started reading that. And so like then come like third semester, I was like, okay, why don't I take a course in that? Um, and I really, really loved it. And because like it's kind of like it felt unclear to me how like physics needed me. It felt like I could do physics, but it didn't feel like there was something specific in me about it. Whereas biology, it felt like, oh, that's super interesting. And like it's as a student scientist, like when I was at school as a school scientist, I had like done some biology things. I had simulated how trees work. Can you imagine it? Like these things outside there that like are growing with like green leaves on it and like it was very cool. Um, and I was like, yeah, biology is super interesting. So in any case, I started studying kind of biology at the same time, not officially. Like officially, that's the interesting thing. Now, like if you look at my transcripts from school, and university, I'm like a complete loser. And like I was like typical B, C grades and all kinds of things. I didn't care about school. I was like playing card games with my friends under the tables. I wasn't like kind of the student who just like always shows up and does the homework. Like I notoriously didn't do my homework. Don't do it the way I do. Not like let's be clear about it. But like that's kind of where I started. And then also at university, my grades went great. Not like I was like a B-ish student, but I took lots of like advanced seminars that I wasn't supposed to do, for which I basically get no credits, but that like I found super interesting. And like I was starting to then, so when I was doing molecular biology, I like when I started taking these courses, I started hanging out with like other molecular biology folks. And I was like, wow, the things that I can tell them are actually kind of useful for them. And I told them about like how molecules diffuse and how I think about like developmental neurobiology. And I took courses in that area. So in any case, like the upshot is it was like remarkably not like a planned trajectory. It was like I was doing this thing, but above all, I was like listening to like where the universe would like call me, like kind of had the eyes open for that. And I was of course wrong. Like molecular biology, I didn't do much for a very long time afterwards, but it seemed just like so cool. And in any case, so like after in Germany, you do after 3 years, do you do this like 1 year research thing? And I was like really excited about it because like I didn't overly care about university courses, but I was always really into research. So in any case, like as that was getting closer, I went to like the physicist and I was like, here's a bio professor who wants to work with me, and we want to build like this molecular biology model of how brains grow. It was basically like differential equations and solutions to that. And I thought, like, this is what physics is. And I'm like, look at what physicists do. Like, lots of them basically spend their life solving differential equation. So I was like, yay, that's like physics. Like, let's go. Like, that's interesting. And the physicist was like, young man, that's not how we think about physics. That might have differential equations, but like, it's really not physics. And I was like, oh, come on. Like, in any case, didn't work. But then in summer, I met this professor from Zurich who was like, you know what? Like, why don't you come to Zurich? In Zurich, so I was studying in Heidelberg, Germany. They were like, in Zurich, we think that what you want to do is like very much physics, and that would be totally fine with us. So I basically defected from Heidelberg, Germany, and after 2 years, like joined Zurich instead, just because and it, because I was into that research. And this is something that I want to talk with you in a second, like being into research. That's what it's all about. Like really like and when I say I was into it, I'm like I like nodding out on things. When I was into developmental neurobiology, I would like read all the papers, but not just like read the papers that you can quiz me on, but like try and find the spots that are soft. Like, yeah, I believe this. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I don't believe this. So, like, what's the evidence for that? And I would like bother my professors about it. They were probably happy that I would leave the university eventually. But like in any case, then like basically when I went to Zurich, these guys were like simulating neurons, totally far away from where my thoughts were before, but I like totally resonated with it. It's like kind of like, yeah, they use differential equations to describe neurons. I thought about like that I would be simulating like tissue, how brains are made, instead of now I'll be simulating what individual neurons do. So in any case, with that, then I went to Zurich and then I did my diploma thesis there, and I basically just stayed and did my PhD thesis there just as well. So that's kind of my undergraduate career. And if you ask me what the things were that kind of brought me onto the science career, it was just like really love and nodding out about topics and specialization. Like a lot of people get great grades, but when I hire students for like PhD students or something, I don't care about their grades. I care about like them nodding out about the topic. And I think a lot of good professors, in fact, almost all my like top professors that I admire most, they're not about like show me a straight A thing. They're more like, yeah, tell me something interesting that I'm willing to talk with you about. And of course, like I had like a million things about brains that I was willing to talk about because I was like nodding out about it. Like it's kind of like it's like if you find stuff that resonates with you, like just dive right in. And like so a lot of people when they then focus on like applying to labs, they're very much like okay, like here's my skills. I have some computer science, I have some neuroscience. It's like now let's like carpet bomb everyone and send to them. Whereas like for me, like the career progressions were always rather like here's this like super small thing that I'm like really, really excited about. And there's only like 10 people doing this like super small thing that I like really know all the papers about that I really care about. And let's only apply to those. And like I always got accepted exactly where I wanted to be. And why? Because like from a professor's perspective, it's super attractive. Oh, sorry. Oh, I need to sneeze and now I can't sneeze. It's like, someone should solve the neuroscience of that, why that's happening. But in any case, like basically all my career progressions just came with me like falling mad in love with ideas and then just like looking for a place where someone would accept me with my ideas. And like for the professors, if you go with a strategy like that, it's like much better for your like soul in a way because like you'll be scientist, like you're a neuroscientist, you care about it. Like it's kind of like it's in you already. And at the same time, it's like much more attractive for like the professors because they're like, oh, that person like actually cares about like this super, super obscure thing that we're actually doing here. That's at least how I always look for students. Okay, those are two very different questions. Let me first highlight how the day-to-day is for me. I show up at work at 9. I make a second coffee, and then my day is pretty much nonstop meeting people. I meet people online, I give talks, I meet my students, I meet my collaborators. And in computational neuroscience, I think an awful lot is about generating ideas. So it's less so that I'm doing, it's more like I sit down and think. And I think with other people who I like thinking with. So I sit down, and often it's like when I have a visitor, I make them coffee and I make like nice latte art. So it's like I make like I have a nice espresso machine and it looks really beautiful. And it's kind of like there is like an act of like we get together, we like accept one another as people, and then we share ideas, and it's just wonderful and it's fun. And in computation, less so in experiments, not like in experiments, it's often that like there's a lot of like groundwork that you need to do. Like you need to get the mice, you need to like get the money to do the things with the mice, you need to then get do the recordings. Like there's like a lot of pieces. In theory, it's more like you're trying to find the right ideas, and once you have the right ideas, like the work is like relatively obvious. So I spend most of my days basically like just talking with people, and like that's visiting students, visiting postdocs, professors. I basically spend most of my days just like thinking about things with others. Now, as a student, things are of course slightly different. Like when I was a student, my day as a computational neuroscience was more like I go to work. I had like this problem where like a lot of people are like they're like very regulated. They show up at some time, leave at some other time. It would be more like I'd go and I'd kind of work until I couldn't, and like until I was worn out. And then I'd have cake, and then I'd come back and work. And as long as I'm worn out, until I'm worn out, then I'd have lunch and work. And then I was running like a 28-hour scale or something. And by the time it was Friday, my day-night cycle was completely messed up. And then the weekend, I would like do things good. Like I love hiking and being outdoors. So like I'd be like going out with my friends. So that's the typical day. Like, let's talk about the life cycle for papers. Like, um, so for me, kind of like papers are the rhythm of science. Papers work like that. Early on in the paper, we don't yet know what questions we want to ask about the universe. What do you do if you don't yet know it? You sit down with people that are complementary. Like if I sit down with a molecular biologist and I'm a computational person, maybe we can find something how like computation can help them. If I sit down with like ethologists, maybe we can find something like where computation can help the ethologist. Like all these interdisciplinary things are often the source of that. It's also now, of course, that I'm professor, I always work with students, often collaborative teams. And it's kind of like this, like sitting with the ideas. Not like a lot of people are like, okay, let me start. And it's just like, what about we don't start, but first think about like something that's worth working on. So I think like not starting immediately and keeping this like it's like almost a tension because you're like, but I haven't done anything. No, but you have like just spent the last 2 weeks, the last month, the last 2 months thinking about good questions. That is not time wasted. That is like the best time. And so that basically at the end of that, I sit down with the students and we do an exercise where we write the abstract. It's a pretend abstract because we haven't done the research yet. But we always do that before we even start working on a paper. And at that point of time, we kind of write down what our question is, why this is a good question, why someone cares, how we will answer experimentally the question or with computational math or like you name it, and then ultimately what it will mean for the world. The cool thing is at that point of time, before we even started doing any research, we will kind of know if what we'll discover will be interesting. No, and so this is the first part of that rhythm. Then there's the second part of the rhythm where the work is done. Like the student sits down and codes up stuff. And I'm like mostly useless by now for that because they're actually better than me at that. So in any case, there's this piece where then like research is done, or consider experiments, or like an experiment is done at that point of time. And then as soon as there's some data, some results, we go and we revisit the logic of the paper, the abstract. And then like all the data is done, and then we kind of sit together and write the paper. And like I wrote a paper on how to write paper. It's called 10 Simple Rules for Structuring Papers. It's been read by more than 1 million people. A lot of people consider it useful when they write papers. If you write your first paper, I recommend at least looking into it. It's like, I think a lot of people find that it helps them for writing. But that's the rhythm. Like you can say that's the metronome of research. Now, like a career as a professor is that you do like a few papers in parallel with different students usually, although my students always collaborate. It's always like people with one another. But you kind of go and like line up paper after paper so that they kind of jointly kind of like tell like a bigger story, something that like if you want that you could write a book with. For example, I did a lot of things. It's called Bayesian models of human behavior, where so the idea is not like the world is full of uncertainty. If you see your hand on the screen, how do you know how far your hand is? Well, you can use like how big it is, and you can also use like how fine the lines are on the hand, and you can so you can use multiple things. And the idea is you always have uncertainty in what you see and what you feel and so forth. And Bayesian models of perception are about like how you combine those in a good way. And that was, and I spent about 10 years doing that. And at the end of it, I wrote like the book, a textbook that explains all the methods. And at some level, that for me is like the end of like that part of my life. I strongly believe that for professors, it's really important to renew themselves roughly every 10 years or so. So I had a period where I was doing like statistics of movement. Then I had a period where I did movement science. Then I had a period where I did neural data analysis. Then I had like a causality period. Right now, kind of I'm drifting back into like a neuro AI, neural networks understanding it direction. But that's kind of the rhythm of a professor's life. And now the rhythm of a student's life is more like over the period of a PhD, you're going to write like handful of papers, and you will then produce a completely made up story of how like that was what your plan was all along. And like in reality, you just do research that seems like super interesting at a time. And these like meta rhythms where multiple papers make like a joint story, that's like in construction, that's not real. People just do it. Most labs have like a really discernible focus. Like most labs do like a narrow thing. What I try to do with my lab is unusual in the sense that I try to rather look for things that should happen that aren't happening yet. So what that means is that the typical trajectory of students in my lab is like it's really weird. They start kind of with an entry point, and then they take some angle and do like something entirely different. So, for example, David Rolnick, who founded Climate Change AI, he was a postdoc in the lab. The idea here would be like theory of deep learning, and he ended up bringing the world together on how we can use AI to basically do something about the climate catastrophe. Complete angle, complete change. Or we had Daniel Acuna in the lab. Daniel Acuna wanted to model how people like solve little tasks on computers. And instead, he built algorithms that detect scientific fraud at scale. So basically, if biologists fake data, they don't just make up data. That's too hard, in particular when it comes to images. You know, like how you're going to make the how you're going to fake an image of how it looks like when you slice the brain into like little slices. Very difficult. Instead, what they do is they take an image and pretend it shows something else. So what he came up with, he came from computer science. He was like, well, I could mine through millions of papers and find who like basically says that their data shows one thing, but in reality, the figures from another paper. And he did that on millions of them, and he's like professor at Boulder, like that basically does like science fraud detection. And these kind of like trajectories, um, or we had people in the lab that kind of came from a computational background and did like a new branch of molecular biology, where it was like, how can we record time varying data onto DNA? So a lot of people in the lab kind of take these like extreme angles and like end up coming out in a very different way. So in that sense, like my lab, like it's hard to kind of say what it is that we do. But let's say for the last like 5 years or so, we've been very concerned about causality. So causalities, if we want to know one thing, does it affect another thing? How can we find out? Well, traditionally, you'd say if often this happens and then that happens, it's an indication of there being a causal thing. But for example, back then they had like this finding that in summer, when kids eat a lot of ice cream, a lot of kids also get polio. And they were like, oh, look, maybe ice cream makes polio. Wouldn't that be shocking? If only we could get the kids to eat less polio. But of course, we now know that ice cream totally doesn't give you polio at all. In fact, what's rather happening is like when it's summer, people hang out with one another and they don't wash their hands all the time, and then they get polio. So it's kind of the summer that made the like risk structure for it. It's not the ice cream that made you get polio. And so in that space, there's a lot of prompts in a lot of areas. Take neuroscience, for example, no, where you can say, in neuroscience, we want to know, does one neuron influence another neuron? How can we know if one neuron is influencing another neuron? Well, maybe we see often that neuron is active and then that other neuron is active, but that can be misleading because there can be another neuron that makes both of these neurons be active. So I'm very concerned in that space. So we had a lot of activity in the lab in that area. And I think I think like right now, my interest drift a little bit into the angle between machine learning and neuroscience. So I currently also co-lead CIFA LMB, which is kind of like a leading deep learning group in the world. And so I'm asking a lot of questions like how to use ChatGPT well, how we should even think about ChatGPT. What is this thing? What is a large language model? How can we build them so that like they're less bad in many different ways of being bad? Um, but again, like that's why it's so difficult. Now, like the typical professors, like this is the thing that we do. And whereas for me, it's really much more like a drift where I kind of follow, in a way, I follow my students. Now, like I hire like students that I think are like super brilliant, and then I mentor them well, and they kind of do whatever they think is good. I mean, look, I propose things, but I never make students do things. I'm like, like this is an interesting problem, I think. What about thinking in this direction? And some of them like, oh yeah, like that's a very good direction. And some of them are like, what about we go that direction? And I'm like, yep, let's see. Like as long as you go there well, as long as you do like, see, it's all like from my perspective, it's all about like love for the science. Basically, regardless of which direction you take, if you're like all in, then it's going to be awesome. And it's going to be a great journey for you and the professor and everyone who's involved. Whereas if it's like, yeah, it's like a career, it's like I want to like do the right things, then it's much harder to kind of do interesting things because like, where are the interesting things? And like the interesting things are never like like sugar on the surface. You just need to scoop them out. Someone's going to tell you, go here and here it is. They're always like somewhere deep. And if you do like really new things, they're less deep than if you do like old things. So like, and that's why I always do these things between these fields. Like there are people who are like probably put in many more hours than I do. There are probably people, no, there's no doubt there's people who are much more brilliant than I am. There's people who know much more. There's people who have much more resources and money and funding than I do. But I don't want to be there. I want to be in a place where like I'm unique, where I can do something that is different from what anyone else in the world would be doing. And so that's why I'm always looking for like these new areas. It's also one of three Dijkstra's rules. Do you who knows who Dijkstra is? Okay, no one heard of Dijkstra. So Dijkstra is one of the most influential computer scientists of our time. And read up on Dijkstra. It's like a set of like really cool algorithms and very cool stories about him. But in any case, people ask like Dijkstra, great Dijkstra, how do I know if research is good? What are the good ways of doing science? And he defined three rules for that. The first one is always do science at the hardest level that you can sustain it, at the best level that you can do it. Like you can always do like, you can always make algorithms better, or you can ask yourself, what would it mean to solve a problem optimally? And that like second approach in computer science always works much better because like now you make it usable for like lots of people. So that's the first thing. Like always do this stuff as hard, the highest quality standards that you can live with. I'm not saying anyone should do career suicide for it, but I'm saying like as long as you can, do the best crazy stuff that you possibly can. And that's Dijkstra says it. Not like I'm just like another guy, but like Dijkstra is like big time computer science professor. So that's Dijkstra. Dijkstra's first rule. The second one is um, if when you're in doubt to do either something that matters for society or something that you can do well, always do the things that you can do well because at least something gets done well. Now, like if you just if you just if you just do it um, and you do it poorly and society cares about it, you might get a paper out of it, but you won't make a dent into the universe. You need to do stuff really well. And then the third one is that when there's a problem that someone else who's at least roughly as competent as you, if they will solve that soon, then you shouldn't do it. Why? Because like, what's the point that two people do the same thing in the universe? Let someone else do it. Like there's enough problems in the world for everyone. So you don't need to do it if someone else can do it. And so those are Dijkstra's rules. And I certainly try to live by them. Yeah, let's first make sure that we're all on the same page on that. So if you read a random paper in your chosen field, most of the time, and you ask yourself, is that really a meaningful question? Most of the time, you'll find that it's not. It often, like a lot of medical papers, kind of ask a question that can't even medically be relevant. A lot of conceptual papers is like built on assumptions that like on the first page, you're like, let's assume this. And it's just like, why would we assume something that is like so obviously not correct? So there's like lots of papers that don't really have questions. And then out of those that do have questions, a lot of them build their analysis on like mistaken logics. Why? Because people are so busy writing papers that they don't take the time really thinking through it. And it's a real problem. Like the system in which you're joining is full of that incentive of like produce, produce, produce. But but to really make progress, you need to actually think through it. And that's why it kind of helps to, at least on top of like professionally doing things, to like also nerd out about it. You know, if you're like really excited about it, if you really care about it, you will put in the extra work to like make sure that you're sure about it. And then if neither of the first two are true, and we've done some meta-analysis, it's like really quite bad that like a lot of papers just like logically don't make sense. But of those that do, a lot of them, about half of them, don't reproduce. So I take the same experiment that like someone did, I replicate everything I can. I work with the authors. I take 10 times as many subjects, and it's not true. And that's a like, or like it doesn't replicate. You know? Like, and if things don't replicate, it's very hard to know things about the world. There was like a study, they like replicate the 10 experiments where people found like mouse cancer cures for mice. And like out of these 10, I believe only one or two actually worked out. Which means like we live in this world where we have this literature of like millions of papers, and a good proportion of them describes things that aren't like really real. And a lot of those that describe things that are real misinterpret what they're finding there. And so this leads to a situation where it's like very hard to make progress in science because you don't know what you can trust. And so when I talk about Rigor, and basically my main job now is Rigor, I built this initiative for the NIH. It's pretty big, and we want to build materials that will teach how to do rigorous science, because like most places no one teaches it. Now, like, how do you design a good experiment? How do you like design a good data analysis pipeline? Like these things at most universities, they're not even taught like at all. Or if they're taught, they're like, it's very peripheral, where people are like, yeah, we should like do a little bit of that. But in reality, there's so many ways of like making a mistake. Now, like, let me give you an example. Now, like a lot of people do experiments where they ask, does the drug like help a mouse, for example? Now, mice, as you may know, come in litters. Not like a mouse makes like a bunch of babies. And a lot of people take like one litter and do the surgery on that litter, and take another litter and do no surgery on them to see if there's a difference between them. But guess what? Like different mouse families have a lot in common with one another. Not like kind of like if you have the same mom and dad, you will be more similar to one another than if you're from a different family. And like the effect is that there's like a litter effect. That means that if your surgery doesn't do anything for the mouse, it might look like it's a remarkably effective treatment simply because you didn't randomize which mouse gets into which treatment. So there's all these ways how we do mistakes in science. And and a lot of them are logically clear. And like once you think through it, could it be that the effect that I see is because of something else? Now, could it be that it's like polio, where like there's like ice cream and polio disease cases, but like they both happen in some on average, but they don't cause one another. And like those are the things that we're worried about, and that's why we try and build good teaching materials for that. Let's start with the negative effects that I think aren't negative at all. So in my career, I had a whole bunch of cases where we had papers that like clearly could be published in Nature, or like in a high profile, like for professors, kind of like in your career, at best, you'll have like a handful of like very visible papers that everyone gets to talk about. And people are really like, we should do as many of those as possible. And it's really good for your career, because if you have them, everyone will be like, oh, you're wonderful. You like publish in Nature. In fact, like you did that too. No, like your announcement was like, Konrad Kording is wonderful, with the implication because he writes Nature papers. But in reality, um, while that might be good for your career to have them, what is much better is to like be true to reality, like to like you don't want to fool yourself. Like, look, you could all go and join a company and you'd make twice as much money than if you do research. Why on earth are you doing research if it means that you'll be doing shoddy research. It makes no sense. And so in that sense, kind of like my attitude there is like, I'm happy to like not publish things if they're wrong, because basically I'm here because I feel I can provide a service to the world. Like it's kind of like I'm not here to optimize my success at some level. Sure, I want to like be paid and things, but like in all our lives we have degrees of freedom. And like, and in that specific case, like when we have a result that like looks like it's too good to be true, we just get more data to make sure that it's true. For example, we had that situation where it looked like we could near perfectly diagnose if you have Parkinson's disease based on data from your phone. If it was true, that would be spectacular and of course publishable in the best journals. It turns out that what we did was a simple statistical mistake, which is like we tried a lot of ways of analyzing our data until we found something that like showed what we were trying to do. Now, like in this case, it was a little complicated. We were doing machine learning, and in machine learning, you have these things that's called overfitting. Overfitting usually happens if you take the data that you'll be testing on and use the data to develop your algorithm. Now, on paper, our algorithm wasn't doing that. No, we had like, we don't know, like 100 people. We would divide those 100 people into two groups, one of size 90 that we use for training, then a set of 10 that we use for testing. It's called cross-validation, that procedure. In principle, it's totally fine. But it's not fine because us as team members, we will be looking at the test set. Like we will be looking at all the data. We will be trying lots of algorithms. Lots of people did that. And so we basically hacked ourselves to great results. And then what we did is we were like, okay, let's look like at another data set that has nothing to do with that. Let's bring in new patients. And we were basically as bad as chance then. But we were like 90% correct before that. How's that possible that we go back to chance? Well, that's the nature of like accidentally lying to yourself. Like you try things and they work. But you forget that you tried lots of things. And if you try lots of things, eventually things will randomly work. In particular, if you have the things that are typical in medicine, which is like maybe only 100 data points. So it's so easy to kind of accidentally fool ourselves. In a way, we're like the easiest people in the world to fool because like we have all the same, we kind of come from a place where we had good reasons why we'd be doing that. So of course we'd be easy to fool. But like that's why like this rigor thing is so important to me. It's kind of like if you want, like it's hygiene for your science. It's kind of like how can we minimize the chance that we will actually be fooling ourselves, taking full and granted that we will always be fooling ourselves. Like we want to see certain things. If we want to see certain things, of course we will see them because we'll look until we see them. So kind of like there, it's like, no, but like the problem is that there is a real trade-off. Like it's kind of like our choice is either we will with relatively high probability lie to ourselves and we will be a little more successful, or we will not lie to ourselves and will be less successful. And like in a way, this is like a very immoral, like a very difficult stance. Like, are we willing to like take that cost for doing it? Well, my answer is yes, we should, because like, look, like if you care primarily about career success, then like Google has jobs for you, or like whoever you want to work with. But like there are companies that have jobs for you that will pay you better and treat you better. And like jobs in industry tend to be like mental health more positive. Like people like teams in industry tend to be more positive with one another than in academia. Although I do hope that like the little island where my students and myself live seems to be a very positive, happy, supportive environment, but like not all environments in science are like that. Okay, wonderful question. Let's first talk about how to get into comp neuro, and then we'll talk about like what the career paths are there. So how to get into it, you primarily need strong computational training. Why is that? Neuroscience, like there's lots of degrees where they teach you neuroscience. There's lots of degrees where they teach you biology. If you look at the world's leading people in computational neuroscience, very, very few of them actually have a degree in neuro or biology, or at least if they have a degree, they also have a computational degree. Why is that? So the the key, I think, to career success is that you want to be unique. You don't want to be like everyone else. You want to do something that is different to everyone else. The problem is like, how can we be different in neuroscience? Like we can be different if our background is basically biology, these people get taught very similar things, not like the standard textbooks in Europe, and everyone learns the same things. There are like certain ways of analyzing data, and everyone learns the same way of analyzing data. There's certain ways of thinking about biology, and everyone learns that way of thinking. It's a very like storytelling-y way. It's kind of like, here's what we know about neuroscience. There's the biggest book in neuroscience is probably called Principles of Neuroscience. There's not a single principle in the whole book. It's just like stories about stuff that someone measured at some point of time. So it's it's much of neuroscience is very narrow. So how can I be different in that area? Well, by like actually having a different education. What can you do? Math and neuro, electrical engineering and neuro, physics and neuro, philosophy and neuro, like basically. But now the question is, where do you need to get your degree from? And a lot of people are like, well, I should get a degree in neuro and I can read up a little on the other side. But like that doesn't make you good enough on the other side. So if you want to be eventually a neuroscientist, it's probably, in my view, and look, I'm biased, but I can point you to so many professors that kind of like, so like among the people that are like amazing in the field that I collaborate with, the vast majority kind of comes from weird angles. Like a surprising number of people have like a background in full-on philosophy. A surprising number of people like design microprocessors, kind of like they come, and of course, like the physicists, and there's a bunch of statisticians, but they tend to come from the outside. Why? The field has so much of an appetite for new ideas. And there's so many people in neuroscience that all come from the same background. And I think this is true in all areas. If you want to succeed somewhere, you're probably better off first learning something else because then you can be unique in that area. And now the neuroscience, the biology part of it, in my view, and of course, every field feels like that. But I think it's learning the biology is relatively easy. Once I really get into neuroscience, I took a, a, a big textbook there and basically read every night like a chapter about it and like in great detail about neuroscience. And then it felt like 1,000 pages later, I was kind of at least at the level where the other neuroscientists were, because kind of like reading those books is relatively easy. So like from that, like if you want to be in computational neuroscience for sure, it's really helpful to first focus on building orthogonal skills that you can then bring into that field. Now, let's talk about career project process. Now, like people usually do an undergraduate degree first. That's where you build your skills primarily. Then you join a PhD lab. The PhD lab, the supervisor is unbelievably important. People are like, oh, I want to be at X university. Your university is by and large irrelevant relative to your supervisor because that's the person who will like really like bounce off ideas with you and like introduce you to other people. So it's super important there. And then uh, and then there's multiple paths. Let's talk about the paths. There's like the traditional professor path, where you'll usually do like after your PhD, where you get paid for like it's not like PhD students make like 30 some $1,000s a year or something, and after like 4 years of doing that, 5 years, it depends on what 4, 5, 6 years of PhD, you're kind of like finished with that. Then you, in most cases in neuro, you first do a postdoc, like between 2 and 4 years, sometimes a little longer, where you'll be paid like $60,000 a year. I don't know the numbers by heart, but where it's kind of like specialized training. It's often like what you're looking for postdoc is kind of a mentor who will really help teach you, like find an area that can be yours, that will make a university hire them for that. Whereas if you're more like on the computer science side, you can often jump directly from a PhD thesis into being professor. And then you'll be working as professor and like the R1 starting salary. So like I like giving people like ideas about like also those numbers. No, like you'll probably start at like in company or like in the $100,000 to $120,000 a year like range as a young professor, which then like goes up a little over time. So that's the professor track. The alternative is the computational field has traditionally been very happy to hire computational neuroscientists to kind of do neural network stuff. So lots of comp neuro folks are now working for Google DeepMind or Google Brain or like or for Facebook, kind of like, in fact, like a lot of the leaders in that field kind of come from comp neuro. Jan LeCun, who's famous for like is one of the godfathers of deep learning. He would occasionally come to like these little scrappy workshops that they organized for neuroscientists because he was like really part of that field. And like I think like, and the cool thing about a computational neuroscientist is like you have this big vocabulary of like computational ideas that you can use for all kinds of things. And so a lot of people then like join these like neurotech fields that build prosthetic devices, like think Neuralink, think kernel, kind of like broadly like interfaces that interface with brains. There's always a lot of demand for computational neuroscientists. Altogether, I think the job market for computational neuroscientists has been spectacular since I've been in that area 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. Especially, I really like how you emphasize how we really have to find something unique about ourselves and what fields we're interested in, especially even in a popular field like computational neuroscience. All right, I see a bunch of
Let,
questions in the chat.
let,
I
let
know we
me,
have 7 minutes left, but Conrad, if you're willing to stay maybe 10,
can,
15
yeah, I'd
minutes.
be
Yeah,
happy to stay longer. Can I briefly say something for 2 minutes that could be super
yeah,
useful for a lot of
yeah,
people?
for sure. We'd
So,
love that.
so a lot of people ask me how to apply to a lab, both like while you're like maybe an advanced undergraduate or when you apply for a PhD thesis. I think there's only one good way of doing it. There's the obvious way of doing it. I'm the best at everything. Here's my transcript, straight A's from MIT. I'm also like great in these other 5 ways. Good. If you're that person, like you don't need to listen to anyone, like everything does everything by itself. But in reality, most people aren't like that. In particular, me, myself, early in my career wasn't like that. Here's how I think for most people the right application is. You write to a professor, you're like, I'm a dear professor, I'm a huge fan of your field. And then you want to sketch how that professor's next paper will look like. And I believe if you win at that game of correctly guessing that, you're very likely to be hired there. Why is this so great as an application? Like, so the email is like super short, like 5 lines max. It's like, dear professor, I'm a big fan of the field that you're in. I think it would be wonderful to do the following experiment and analysis and so forth, because I think it speaks to this question that is super important. I would love to talk with you. Best Konrad. Why is this so great? Like, the professors always get the same email. Like you have no idea. I'm getting like multiple emails a day and they're always identical. It's like, here's my name, here's my university, here's my GPA, 1 page. I can't read these things anymore because they're all the same and I have no idea like who's good and who's not. Whereas if you're like Konrad, I'm a big fan of models for causality in computational neuroscience. I loved how you did it with Ben Lansdale. Here's a way how I think we could like make the performance better. I'd be like, oh, read my paper, understood my paper, and made the proposal to do something good. No, you'll be like, oh, but Konrad, we aren't yet at that level. If we're in a new area, how would we know it in the beginning? That is true. But that resonates with what you just said. Like if we focus our interest on something and we go deep instead of like doing like the top level papers and lots of things, then that area that we're deep, we'll be nodding out, we'll be talking with our friends about it, they will hate us about it at parties. And instead, it's going to be like, and we will not be able to apply to all professors. There's only going to be like the 10 people who actually care about this narrow thing that we're currently nodding out on. But to those 10 people, you can now prove that you're part of that group. Like we are nodding out on that. And because we do, we can like know how your next paper will look like. So if you can pull that off, that is the ultimate way of applying for like anything from being like a research assistant as an undergraduate to being like a postdoc or even a professor later in life.